Travis,
What
is
up?
that you there in Athens, Georgia? What are you doing?
I'm in Albany.
Albany. Why do I confuse those two?
Well, there's only one city that people care about in Georgia, and that's Athens. Well, there's Savannah and Atlanta. So there are three cities in Georgia that people care about. Something, well, I guess Augusta. So there's a fourth. Yeah, fourth. The Masters are there. So
Savannah is one of the coolest towns I've ever been to. I really
it's
had
very
a good
cool town.
time there.
Albany is one of the least cool towns you'll ever go to.
I'm sorry to hear that.
We have so much potential, though. In all seriousness, we don't live up to it. So
What holds you back?
I'll just reduce it to internal squabbling.
Okay.
When we contacted each other, I was on the phone. I don't think you'll care if I say this out loud. Eli Ayala. You know who that is?
No.
Eli's become a friend of mine since the conference that you didn't show up to.
Yeah.
Last fall. He and I became friends. You weren't there to kick out the riffraff that would come in and speak to me, and Eli came in and spoke to me.
And okay.
Well, he's one of the number one YouTube Van Tillian apologists.
Oh, wow.
He is, if you want, I mean, I love the guy. He's got a great disposition. I disagree with him vehemently on apologetics. So we were just kind of debating some issues. I took his call, even though I was waiting for you to get on, because I don't care about you. And I care more about theology than my friendship with you.
Clearly. So, I can see it. Yeah.
I say that with no remorse whatsoever. Did you hear that the kid, the track kid, the athletes, the boy that murdered the other boy because he stabbed in the heart?
Yeah.
He recently said, I have no remorse. I mean, wow. He deserved it because he touched me. He grabbed me. So he deserved to get killed.
What do we do with that? What do we do with that as a culture? I mean, there's nothing new about that. That's human nature. But where do we go with that?
There are only two ways: downhill, or we begin to recover a sense of decency. People have murdered for millennia. People have stabbed each other in the back. But at least in earlier generations, there was an attempt on at least a broad cultural level for our leaders to never, and even people in public, to never display themselves this way. And it did make for at least a safer world, if still an imperfect one. I think that all that rhetoric is going to do is just increase the murders, increase the killing, increase the violence.
Yeah.
So it makes me very sad.
Seems like we're going in two directions, Travis, as a country. It seems like there's this side that's just become really narcissistic and self-focused, and people are just drifting off into whatever they think is going to be their identity and is going to make them happy. And then you listen to the apologetic stuff and the Christian stuff, and there's revivals going on and people coming back to the Lord, and church attendance has bottomed out and is at least, not declining, and maybe even going up in some areas. And, this idea that naturalism has kind of run its course. The new atheism is no longer new. And there's really good arguments to all that stuff. Both of these things are happening at the same time. And there's a real polarization going on because of it.
Right. And yeah, I have no solutions to the problem other than just to point it out and, stand against it as best I can.
Yeah.
To whatever degree I can. We are becoming we are living in weird times. I had a dear friend who texted me and goes, we're just living in weird times. We have an American Pope, as we discussed last time. By the way, made a mistake on our last program.
What's that?
He's not a Cubs fan.
Yeah, he's a White Sox fan. That's right.
So I was driving literally the next day after we recorded. I'm driving down the road and I heard I was listening to a news show on the radio, and they were like, "Yeah, he's a White Sox fan." I was like, "Well," but they did. I wasn't lying to our audience. I would never lie to our audience. I did hear that he was a Cubs fan, and I said, "I hear he's a Cubs fan."
Yeah.
But that was what I heard, and they did say the initial reports went out that he was a Cubs fan. Cubs fans have grabbed onto this, and there were some White Sox fans that said, "Well, contact his brothers, and they'll tell you." And apparently, his brothers were interviewing, like, no, he was a White Sox fan all of his life. So here at Notes On, we always correct ourselves whenever we display false information.
That's right. I know you would lie to me, but you would never lie to the audience.
I lie to you all the time, but never to our audience.
That's right.
So,
all right.
Smiley that way.
So I want to talk some more about my question I had last week. Maybe you've thought about it. Maybe you haven't. We talked a bit. Why should we as Protestants who don't plan on ever being Catholic care about who becomes Pope?
He's the most famous human being on the planet. Whoever the Pope is, he's the most famous human being on the planet. President Trump will come and go. A pop singer will come and go. No one will ever be more famous than the Pope, because he commands the allegiance of over 1 billion people who claim the name of Christ. That's
right, and they are brothers and sisters.
Brothers and sisters. So, that reason alone, just being informed about how the world works and how the most famous person in the world becomes that, you can't really understand how our world is working unless you know that process.
Yeah,
and be aware what he says will sway the opinions of hundreds of millions, if not over 1 billion people,
and maybe for generations.
That's right. It's the same reason every Christian should read the Quran.
Yeah.
Why should I interest myself? Well, it's a book that influences the opinions of over 1 billion people.
But even more to the point, these are, again, our brothers and sisters. These are people who are
absolutely
followers of Christ.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, Travis, I think the passages in the Bible that talk about unity among believers, I think the main way that unity is talked about is a unity that exists, that is there, that is independent of differences in doctrine and Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, that kind of thing. And we just don't recognize it. We put these walls up. They're fake walls. They're not, in a way, they're not really there. They're just there because we think they're there. We don't, imagine, you in your living room, you think there's a wall and you never cross that line, but there's no wall there. And I think, I want to seek out friends who are Catholic. I want to seek out friends who are Orthodox. Just sometimes I do this kind of stuff just because I'm really stubborn, and I want to give the middle finger to the hateful one, and just do this stuff to see what the universe does back at me. I just want. There's so much there to learn. I mean, I've gone through these OCIA classes. There's so much to learn from Catholicism that has changed my faith for the better, even though I'm not going to be a Catholic.
Now, all that can be 2 or 3-way streets. Historically, it's the evangelicals, the conservative Protestants, who were the ones that are trying to tear down barriers. And it was the Catholics throwing those barriers up. I mean, if you proclaim a whole swath of Christians anathema because they believe that we find a right standing before God due to God's unmerited favor alone, secured by Christ's work alone, and received by faith alone. If you declare me anathema, who's thrown up the wall?
Well, that's true. But let's look at it on a more personal one-on-one basis. How many Protestants do you know that are actively seeking out Catholic friends? How many Protestants do you know that pray for the Catholic Church and pray for the Pope? How many Protestants do you know that work towards reconciliation with Protestants and Orthodox? So,
point well taken. Yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting for a minute that Protestants will have work to do, but we historically we have to remember who threw up the wall, who condemned the Protestants, and we had those of us, my spiritual forebears, who honestly read the scriptures and said, "This is what we believe."
right.
They wanted to be a part of the church. You know, in the Lutheran tradition, in the Augsburg Confession, it says in so many words that as a practical matter, there's no problem with the papacy. Like they would have compromised on that, right?
That's very
Because because we do need a leader in the church, and having a monarchical episcopate is a very efficient way of getting things done. And so they were willing to make that compromise but not, they weren't willing to compromise the gospel for that. That's what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel the same way. I would compromise literally, almost anything for the sake of unity, except the gospel itself.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm saddened by this. I mean, I hate the fact that Christians are divided. I see another division coming. Every 500 years, the church divides. In 451, the Coptics departed because of the doctrine that was set forth in Chalcedon or Chalcedon.
And then 1054,
we had the Filioque clause. I wish the Western Church had not added that. As much as I agree with the Filioque, I'm a Filioque advocate, but I don't think that should have been placed into the creed. I think for the sake of unity, that could have been debated among the theologians, and we could have maintained our unity. And the Reformation, I think there were Protestants at the Council of Trent, and I think that had you, when I read through the canons on justification, most of those canons I agree with. But then when it says that I don't have the wording right in front of me, but he who says that his justification is basically imputed to him on the merits of Christ alone. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but it says, "Let him be anathema." That's the one that I'm like, okay, well, I now have to make a decision, and any decision I make is going to be a divided one. I'm going to be on one side of the fence or the other. Even if I say this doesn't really matter, I'm not choosing sides. I'm just on another side.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you're going to make yourself an enemy regardless of what decision you make. And the Catholic Church caused that. There were Catholics who believed in justification by faith. They believed that. And they would articulate that. But then when the church having now spoken, they had to conform or leave. And
So
I find it weird because, I'm not a Molinist, but I'm not willing to call Molinism a heresy. And, the popes historically have not weighed in on the Molinist-Thomist controversy. Now, a lot of people know what that is, but it's the doctrine of middle knowledge. It's the idea that we can reconcile libertarian freedom with God's providence. And they articulate a thing called middle knowledge, which says that God knows what you would do if you were placed under different circumstances. And that's how they reconcile foreknowledge and free will.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't agree with that, but I think it's a view that needs to be articulated, and it is an option, if you will. But the Pope says, I'm not going to weigh in on that. Why didn't they just not weigh in on justification? Why didn't they say, here's where we agree, and here's where we're going to let Christians decide, where they stand? They're free to make a choice here. Well, that would have preserved institutional unity.
It seems to me, Travis, that that's kind of what the Catholic Church does. It takes a perfectly good doctrine and adds 2 or 3 layers to it
Mm-hmm.
that, in my mind, are kind of unnecessary. The Marian dogmas and, the whole purgatory thing. Catholic will admit that it's nowhere in the Bible. It's just a philosophical and theological conclusion they've come to based on it's the only way they can figure out how to resolve a few things. But
Right.
you got to believe it. You have to believe that stuff. And
what I wish the church had done from the 12th century up to our day, really, and a lot of this stopped in the Enlightenment. From the 12th century to, we'll say, 1648. 1648 is the end of the 30 Years' War, one of the most deadly wars that Europe ever saw. And it was a religious war, and they call it the last war of religion.
Yep.
Wars have happened since, and even deadlier wars, unfortunately, but they weren't over religion. They were land grabs, or we don't want that monarch ruling on that throne, something like that. Now, when the 12th century started, the papacy had already begun to amass an incredible amount of power. 50 years within the Filioque clause being added, and the Crusades to boot, had given the Pope incredible temporal power. So much so that when you had groups like the Waldensians questioning clerical authority, they were persecuted and tortured to death. And the papacy reached the height of its power in the early 13th century with Innocent III. And he implemented at the Fourth Lateran Council, for example, declared that transubstantiation is a dogma and began to persecute all Christians who would disagree with it. So Christians are not free to argue their own point if it contradicts established dogma.
Right.
And, and then what they do is they read back into what the fathers are saying. So if the fathers are saying, well, we believe in the real presence of Christ, they automatically think, well, the body, the bread and wine become the body and blood of our Lord.
Transubstantiation, yeah.
But that's not what the fathers taught. Even if that's what the fathers meant, that's not what they said. So the question is, how do you know that's what they meant? Because I believe just as strongly as anybody that there's a special sense in which the Lord really is truly present in the sacrament in a way that he's not present, say, in me now as I speak to you.
Yeah.
I believe that with all my heart. And I believe, therefore, a miracle is going on in the sacrament, if by miracle you mean an act of special grace by which I can be sanctified. And it is one of the few means that God ordains whereby I can be sanctified. How is that not a Christian doctrine? Well, they don't accept my view of the Lord's Supper as true.
Yeah, and we've talked about some of these before. It's like the church just declares that that's the way it was, or declares that that's the way the early church fathers thought. So then you got to believe that that's the way it was. And it's like, we talked about this one. I was really horrified when the Catholic Church is so careful about taking the Eucharist and how that's done and consecrating it, and yet it's okay to give the laity just the bread and not the wine. And it's like, and when I asked the priest about that, he said, well, that's just, the church has declared that that's all right. And how do you argue with it? How do you say that's a serious error? There's nothing in the Bible about taking one or the other.
With the possible exception of the Word of God itself, is there anything more precious than the sacrament? My answer is no.
Yeah.
And It is the minister's absolute, I'm tearing up thinking about this because I'm an elder in my church. It is our charge, it is our obligation to give to the laity the gifts that they are guaranteed, unless they are under the discipline of the church. I am obligated to do this. This is my charge. I cannot deprive my brothers and sisters of the sacrament. I have to do that. And because I love them, I want to do that, because I know that this is the only way that they're going to become holy, through the sanctification of word and sacrament. And so, I mean, I will be the first to say Protestants have such a horrible view of the sacraments. We hold the sacraments in contempt when we don't seek them out and take them.
I agree.
But I mean, to deprive the laity of one half of the sacrament, are you kidding me?
Yeah, that's how I felt. And I even said that I said that to the priest in the OCIA class. I said, I'm horrified.
Yeah. By the way, what did they say when you said that?
Well, then he went on to say that the church has looked at it and declared that that's okay.
Did anybody come up to you afterwards and say, hey, I get why you're horrified, but this is why it's not so horrifying?
No one did. No.
See, I mean, like if I'm sitting in my church and my pastor's teaching a new members class, and he says something about one of our distinctives, and they go, I'm horrified over this, I'm going to seek them out afterwards and try to sit down and have a dialogue and say, I'm not saying that what I'm saying is going to calm everything. I may even accentuate your repulsion, but here's, I would try to reason with them about why we believe this, whatever that, that thing that horrified them is.
Yeah.
So,
I'll go back to what I think I said this last week. I think the state of the world and the state of human beings, we really need all of these divisions. Not all of them. We need some of these divisions. We need the Catholic Church that takes God as seriously as they do. They really, really honor him. The priest said, don't go to Mass and then gab with each other after Mass. If you're going to talk, go outside. And I know that a lot of that is because they have, I believe, a mistaken view of the building itself is somehow holy. But what impressed me about that was that they just take the whole thing. They take God and the sacraments and the Bible in some ways more seriously than Protestants that I know of. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. I really have been moved by that. It's only in the Protestant church that you can pick up a Bible and say, God has led me to start my own church, brother, and go find somebody's living room and start preaching and not really be accountable to anybody. And maybe you do okay, and maybe you don't.
My qualification, though, is that while that kind of thing is allowable in Protestant churches in the modern world, in the sense that people just don't have a serious understanding of who God is, what the church is, and so forth. It is not Protestantism as such that created this kind of attitude. Because you have the same thing going on in the Catholic Church. I mean, you have Sedevagantists who are saying that every pope since the 1950s is a robber pope.
Right.
Okay. So there's that. But then also Luther himself said, if you get a bunch of people that are just reading the Bible for themselves in their own little corner, they all go to hell in their own way.
Yeah.
So that's a quote that Michael Horton has utilized to mitigate this claim that, the Reformation was an exercise in rugged individualism. The Reformation itself was not. What the heirs of the Reformation, what they've done is they've sold their birthright. They've thrown that away. Mm-hmm. And they've replaced it with a really shallow and insipid and just terrible way of viewing the church. And what's happening in our generation is we're all talking about this. Church leaders, this is a big thing now. We're noticing that, thank God, the young people are realizing just how shallow their world is. And they are, I mean, we're seeing what looks like the onslaught of upcoming revival, where you're going to have multiple young people in huge numbers seeking more traditional religion.
Right.
I don't think that we're quite there yet, but we're seeing rumblings of it. And I hope I'm wrong too. I hope maybe we're there, but I just don't sense that we're really there yet. But I'm hearing this all over the place. I have a young student. she just took my seminary class on the life of Christ, and she's 20, and she had a very emotional Christian home that was basically, they were just drunk on emotionalism, never really anchored in scripture, mutton and fruit tradition. And she began seeking, and she went to the Roman Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church. She and her husband, she's a young lady married at the age of 20. They just did the search.
Good.
Came to our church, and she's found a home. And it's the first Protestant church she went to where there was actually a deeply imbibed anchoring in history.
Oh, good.
So, but these things are happening. But I think that anecdote, it doesn't prove anything, but at least it proves that when Protestants, and we don't get it all right in our church, but when we seek to anchor our own tradition in tradition and anchor it in the Reformation, which actually has a pedigree that goes all the way back to the fathers.
That's right.
Calvin, in his debates with Roman Catholics, would quote wholesale full paragraphs of the fathers in his debates with them. The reformers drunk the fathers. They imbibed them, and were very attracted to all the things that they were saying. And they, Calvin said, if you want me to give you a creed, just quote from Augustine. That's, he was a big fan of Augustine. So I don't know. I could go on, but it will be nice if we stop having these churches that are basically concerts with a TED Talk, and we get back to the regular principle of worship and worshiping God as he ordained in the scriptures.
Right. Yeah. And there's so many weaknesses in the Protestant tradition, and that's one of them. But one of the real strengths is that, somebody like me can come along and say to the Catholic Church, you guys are out of your mind, not having both, the bread and the wine. The Catholic Church needs people to keep them tuned up, because they just drift off into weirdness sometimes. Mm-hmm. So both of these traditions, and the Orthodox too, this stuff is really necessary, that we're bouncing off each other, because human nature, even for people who are trying desperately to follow what God says, we can just really go off the rails, all of us, and we need the other side to center us. So in a sense, I believe there's unity right now that needs to be honored and recognized, but I'm also realized that I don't see us ever coming back together as one church, and if we did, we'd screw it up. We'd make a mess of it.
If we did, it would mean that one of the sides in the debate would have to give up what is most essential to their point of view.
Yeah.
So for the Greek Orthodox, it's we will accept the filioque, or we will adopt a more Western approach that, in their view, leaves the mystery, forsakes the mystery for rationalism.
Yeah. Okay,
that's a big pill to ask them to swallow. For the Catholic, for them, what if the Catholic Church said, okay, Luther was right on justification? That means that they have to say that one of their magisterial councils was wrong, which just is the rejection of their view of authority.
That's right. Yeah.
And then, of course, for us to say, well, justification is not that important. That's what our liberal friends say. I use the word friend loosely, but that's what they say. Well, I think to say that the gospel is unimportant is crazy.
Well, it's not Christian. You're outside the circle then.
Yeah. But for us to say it's unimportant or just plain false just is to reject what we think is the gospel. And so there's your tripartite debate going on.
Yeah.
Topics that they want to get in the mix, they're going to have to accept Chalcedon for them to compromise. Well, that's a big pill for them to swallow.
Travis, I think we're out of time, but I just want to say one thing maybe that'll lead us into the next show. In my mind, the only thing that's going to do this is some disaster, something that threatens the actual existence of the church, where Christians have to come together. Imagine if we were invaded as a country by, a Muslim, the unified Muslim, or the Chinese or something, where Christians were persecuted and were in prison together with Orthodox and Catholic and were forced to pray and be unified in that way. Out of those ashes could come some kind of unity. I don't see any other way it can happen.
Well, maybe that's something we can pick up on for next hour.
Yeah. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Travis.